Hello everybody, this is Mr Matthews here with a Loom lecture on great writers, and today is Charles Dickens, 1812 to 1870, 10 questions and answers. So this is kind of background, context for people who are studying Dickens novels, and of course the one that the GCSE students study is Christmas Carol. But I'm not going to actually mention much about Christmas Carol in this lecture because I've done so much on Christmas Carol. This is on Charles Dickens in general, okay? Remember that in the Victorian period, photography came in, and we've got photographs of all the famous Victorians, including Queen Victoria herself, Charles Darwin, and in this case, Charles Dickens. So that is Dickens later in his life. He didn't live that long. I know that people didn't live as long in the 19th century as they do today, but he overworked himself, really. He actually did too many lectures, which is a bit of a worry for me, and he collapsed and died in the summer of 1870 because he'd been advised by his doctor to kind of take it easy, and he didn't take it easy, and as a result he died at the age of 58. Now, Charles Dickens is the most famous writer of the Victorian period and maybe one of the most famous writers of all time. So let's have a look at the life and the work of Charles Dickens. So first of all, question number one. This is a question I posed and you might pose. What sort of childhood did Dickens have? It was a mixed childhood. There was a lot of happiness. He was not born into poverty, although he did understand the problems of the poor, because what happened was his father, who was a clerk, who was working for the Royal Navy in Portsmouth, he was actually born in Portsmouth, and he didn't manage his money very well, and he fell into debt, and he ended up in what was called a debtor's prison. And Charles Dickens, in many of his novels, writes about the debtor's prison. And it was obviously something that was extremely painful for him, because of course it's a bit of a shame when your father ends up in prison. Because his father went to prison, they couldn't afford to pay the fees for school, so he had to work in a shoe factory, really, which was called the blacking factory, where they put blacking onto shoes. And this was in London, and he didn't like this at all, because he felt, as a boy from a sort of a middle class background, he ought to be in school being educated. And he wrote about this sort of humiliation in his novel David Copperfield, because David Copperfield also ends up in a factory in London. Now, Dickens never went to university. He was what we call self-educated. He was in and out of school because of his father's debt problems, so he had to really teach himself. He read huge numbers of books. He read authors like Daniel Defoe, who wrote Robinson Crusoe. He read Jonathan Swift, who wrote Gulliver's Travels. He read about the novels of Walter Scott, who was earlier in the 19th century, just before the time when Dickens came on the scene. And he was well read, he was intelligent, and he loved the English language. And he obviously must have had a natural gift for English, because he was going to go on to write these incredible novels. So this is somebody that did not have a fantastic education, did not have all the privileges of a university education, but was intelligent enough and was hardworking enough to become one of England's greatest writers. His first job was as a clerk, a legal clerk, and he writes a lot about the law in many of his books. Sometimes it's not very complimentary either, particularly a novel called Bleak House, which is an attack on the legal system in Britain and how it doesn't work well for ordinary people. Then he moved to journalism, and he became a reporter in the courts and in Parliament. And I think he must have been interested by some of these speeches that the politicians made, which were a bit kind of pompous and over the top. And I think he put that into many of the characters in his novels as well. So that's question one. What sort of childhood did Dickens have? Question two, I decided this question, what was his first major novel? The answer is The Pickwick Papers, the story of Mr. Pickwick and his friends. And this was 1836, so that is just before Queen Victoria came to the throne, which was 1837. So we always think of Dickens as a Victorian novelist, but his first novel was written even before Victoria came to the throne. Now, The Pickwick Papers is the story of an eccentric gentleman called Mr. Pickwick and his companions. And it's a very light and it's a very comical book. It's full of great characters and a lot of comic scenes. And there's not some of the darker things that you get coming in later on into Dickens's novels. He doesn't really explore the poverty and the conditions. And this is more a light-hearted book. It's extremely long, though, and it was extremely popular. The thing about Dickens's books, by the way, is they came out in installments. A bit like when you watch a soap opera, it leaves you at the end of one episode, like, wanting to know what happens next, but you have to wait until it comes around again. And that's how the Victorians got to know Dickens, through installments. We tend to think of borrowing a book from a library or buying a Dickens novel from a bookshop, and it's all together all at once. But it wasn't like that in the time of Dickens. It came out in installments. So in answer to the question, what was his first major novel? It was Pickwick Papers. Shortly afterwards, just as the time when Victoria came onto the throne, Dickens wrote Oliver Twist, which is a much darker book, which looks at crime and looks at poverty. And it starts off, of course, with the workhouse system. So the question three, why did Dickens attack the workhouse system in Oliver Twist? The workhouse system came in 1834. It was called the Poor Law Amendment Act, and it was designed to reduce the cost of looking after the poor by forcing poor people to go to a workhouse if they didn't have a job and if they couldn't look after themselves. The workhouses were harsh. The conditions were extremely unpleasant. They used to separate the families, so the father would be sent to one part of the prison, the mother and the children to other parts of the prison. Oliver Twist, of course, is an orphan in the book, and the food was not very good, and they were always hungry. And of course, this is the very, very famous scene. Everybody's heard of this scene where Oliver Twist comes up to ask for more. He's asking for more gruel, which is a very, very, very plain sort of a kind of a very watery soup, which is the food they used to give them. So he attacked the workhouse system because he felt that this was a humiliation of the poor. He felt the poor people should be treated a lot more humanely. And given that the workhouse system came in 1834, and he wrote the book in 1837, you can see that he must have been affected in that period when he discovered what workhouses were actually like. And we can assume that he was aware of what a workhouse was. He had some kind of knowledge of how the system worked, and he did not like the system at all. And of course, he also attacks the workhouse in Christmas Carol, where Scrooge says, "Are there no workhouses?" to the charitable gentleman. So this is the idea that Dickens is on the side of the poor, and he did not like the workhouse system. He would have preferred for the rich and the powerful to actually dip more into their pockets to help the poor. This system was designed so that the middle classes and the rich would pay less in poor rates to keep the poor. Because what would happen is that people would rather take the worst job imaginable, the lowest paid job imaginable, rather than to go into the workhouse. So this was a way of disciplining the poor. It was a way of kind of humiliating the poor and stigmatizing the poor. And Charles Dickens did not like the system at all. So this is clearly where Dickens attacks the workhouse system. Next question, which is question number 4. This also applies to Oliver Twist. Was the character of Fagin an insult to Jewish people? Now, this is quite a controversial question, quite a controversial topic. Now, Fagin is the leader of a gang of criminals, which includes the Artful Dodger and Bill Sikes. And they make their living through theft. They are pickpockets and basically petty criminals. And they live in a slum area of London, which was known as Jacob's Island, which is basically Bermondsey area of southeast London. And this was a slum area that was known to Dickens. It was quite notorious in the early Victorian period. Now, Fagin is Jewish. And what happens is that Dickens does exaggerate certain stereotypical ideas of Jews, that they're obsessed with money and that there's something sinister about them. He picked on things which have been used against the Jews for centuries, and ultimately were also used by the Nazis in the 20th century. Extremely unpleasant, extremely stereotypical, where you don't treat people as individuals, you treat them as types. And the stereotype of the crafty and sort of grasping Jew is presented in Fagin. He's not an attractive character at all. Now, Dickens was aware of this later on, and he admitted that perhaps he had been unfair to Jewish people in his portrayal of Fagin. He regretted, perhaps later on, that he had produced this unpleasant character, which was seen to be anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitic is prejudice and hatred towards Jewish people. But the thing about Dickens is he's not necessarily a perfect character. Just because he was a great novelist, and he was one of the greatest writers, perhaps the greatest writer of the Victorian period, does not mean to say that everything about his character therefore is wonderful. There's also some evidence that he had racist views towards black people, which was not unusual in that period. This was the standard, I'm afraid to say. It was an exception that white Victorian men in particular would, and women, I suppose, it was quite unusual for them not to have racial prejudice. It was part and parcel of the whole period of the British Empire, and the idea that white people were superior. And Dickens, we know, said some harsh things about black-skinned and brown-skinned people, and that basically goes to show that however warm he was to the poor people of Britain, and how much in his books he's on the side of the underdog, that does not mean that he didn't have prejudice. In this case, the prejudice came out in the case of Fagin, anti-Semitism, and some of his comments about black people also, which we would consider today is racist. So therefore, just because somebody is a great novelist doesn't mean to say they get everything right about their life. Dickens was not a saint. He was a great man, but he had faults. And if we can understand that, because lots and lots of great people in history have also got quite large faults, and there's nothing unusual or strange about that. Question number 5. Now, despite what I've said, which is not so complimentary towards Dickens, there is no doubt that Charles Dickens was concerned about the differences between rich and poor in Victorian society, in the early and mid-Victorian society. He sympathised with poor people. He did sympathise with the underdog within Britain. And the question I've asked is, did Dickens actually go into the London slums to find out how the poor lived? The answer is yes. He made many journeys into some of the worst slums, or rookeries as they were called, in London, and he saw terrible conditions, unbelievable poverty, and of course the breeding ground for criminal gangs such as the gang which is led by Fagin and Bill Sykes in Oliver Twist. This was something that was not made up in his imagination. He actually saw this. We know that in 1849, Charles Dickens was taken by a police inspector to a notorious slum. It was called the Borough, which is virtually next door to where London Bridge Station is today. And he had to have police protection as he went through, because of course in these areas it was so violent that you could easily end up with your throat cut. So the police had to go in large numbers, and they took Dickens there, and he was absolutely appalled by the conditions he saw. The picture in front of you is by a French artist called Gustave Doré, who drew many pictures of the slums of Victorian Britain. And that really is what that slum in the Borough near London Bridge would have looked like to Dickens. And you can imagine him as he's going through the cobble streets and he's seeing the terrible housing conditions and the unbelievable amount of poverty, and thinking to himself, it's a good job I got police protection, because can you imagine, how I could easily be robbed or murdered. So he knew what the conditions were like. He went in there, and he also attempted to try and alleviate those conditions. He wrote about them in his books, but he also contributed to charities which was trying to improve the conditions of the poorest people. So that's question number 5. Question number 6. What was his own favourite novel? The answer is David Copperfield, which was published in 1850. And this is his favourite because it was autobiographical. In other words, he used a lot of the experiences of his own life in the story of David Copperfield. And Mr. Micawber, who's the character there, who's carrying the cane and has the top hat, alongside David Copperfield, he's one of the big characters in the book. And Mr. Micawber is meant to be modelled on Dickens's father, because Mr. Micawber was very poor at looking after his money, and he was always in debt. And he went to a debtor's prison, and the people who he owed money to, the creditors, were always chasing after him. He said annual income £20, annual expenditure 19.6, result happiness, because he's keeping within his means. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20, ought and 6, result misery. If you spend more than you earn and you get into debt, it's pretty awful. But in actual fact, he never kept to that. In the end, he emigrated to Australia and actually made more of a success of his life. But in terms of what happens in England, he's based on Dickens's father. It's also full of other memorable characters. You have the Peggottys, who are fishermen from Great Yarmouth in Norfolk, and you have Uriah Heep, who was an appalling, hypocritical character, who is basically a fraud and a thief. And it's an extraordinary novel which covers so many aspects of Victorian society, in particular cruelty towards children. Charles Dickens loses his father very early, and he comes into the hands of Mr. Murdstone, who's a stepfather who treats him really cruelly. And that's another thing about Dickens. He did not like cruelty towards children. He did not like cruelty towards children at all. So that is question 6. What was his own favourite novel? Question 7. Now we know that Charles Dickens was in favour of ending the practice of public executions. Did he write about executions in his book? And the answer is yes. Now, capital punishment was not abolished in Britain until the 1960s, which is 100 or so years after the time of Dickens. But up until the year 1867, which is 3 years before Dickens died, people were executed in public. Now that is quite unbelievable. Until the 1960s, they were executed behind prison walls, where the only people present would be the prison governor, a clergyman, priest, who would be there to give the last rites, as it were, to the prisoner, and that was it. But before 1867, people used to turn up in their thousands to watch executions. It was unbelievably brutal. Now, can you actually imagine that? Can you imagine people today saying, "Oh, let's go and watch a hanging. Let's go and watch somebody being hanged outside a prison"? It's quite incredible, but it was considered, in a sense, almost normal. But Charles Dickens thought it was appalling. He witnessed a public execution himself outside a prison called Horsemanger's Lane Jail, and he was so appalled at the behaviour of the crowd, because for the crowd it was just one opportunity to have a wonderful time. There was drunkenness, and there was brawling, and there were people screaming as the execution took place. There was terrible things went on, awful things. And Charles Dickens was absolutely appalled at this sort of thing. So, executions appeared in his books, but he never actually wrote about the execution itself. In All of a Twist, Fagin ends up in the end being hanged. And this is an illustration of Fagin in his condemned cell the night before his hanging. And then in Great Expectations, which came out in 1861, at the beginning of the book, which is set in the marshes of Kent, you can see a gibbet. Now, a gibbet was a gallows, but they kept the body of the executed man inside a cage, swinging in the wind as a warning to other people. And also at the end of the book, the convict Abel Magwitch is just about to be hanged. He's in Newgate prison, and he's about to be hanged, but in fact he dies from fever instead. Charles Dickens believed that criminals should be punished. There should be law and order. He was not against execution for very serious crimes like murder, but he was against public executions. And so for the last 3 years of his life, he must have been pleased that now any criminal who was about to be hanged would be hanged in private, would be hanged within the prison. And you wouldn't have these crowds of drunken onlookers treating it as if it was a kind of sporting occasion or some kind of carnival occasion. He thought that was quite appalling. So that's question number 7. Question number 8. Was Dickens married? Was he a family man? The answer is yes, very much. He was married to a woman called Catherine Hogarth. He fathered 9 children, but this is quite interesting and a little bit disturbing for those that think that Dickens was Mr. Perfect, because he was not Mr. Perfect. He did not treat his wife very well. He treated Catherine Hogarth really badly, and he had a mistress. He had another woman in his life, Ellen Turning. He was not a good family man, but he gave the impression that he was a good family man. In other words, Dickens was a bit of a hypocrite. Now, this is extraordinary, because one of the things that is continually mentioned and continually attacked in the novels of Dickens is hypocrisy. The Victorians had always had a reputation for being hypocritical, because they wanted to present themselves as so respectable and so prim and proper. But of course, behind Victorian society, there was terrible prostitution. There was all kinds of appalling things were going on. But the Victorians kind of wanted to pretend that this was not going on. And Charles Dickens loved to expose hypocrisy in so many of his books. He hated hypocrisy. But he was a hypocrite himself. So this is quite extraordinary. On the right-hand side, you've got a scene from a film about the Christmas Carol. And of course, the Cratchit family are presented as, the ideal of the family. They're quite poor, but there's great love, and there's a great sense of a family life. And Charles Dickens kind of made people feel that that was his ideal of family life. But in actual fact, he was not a good family man. And his treatment of his wife was not very good at all. And in many of his books, he actually attacks men who treat their wives badly, including David Copperfield in terms of his stepfather, who treated his natural mother really badly in the book. And yet Charles Dickens himself was not a family man. So again, he's not Mr. Perfect. But just because, just because he's got this sort of background to his life, that does not mean to say that you can't, say that he's a great novelist. The fact he's a great novelist does not mean that he's perfect in other areas. So we have to understand that great people are great in certain areas, but they're not great in all areas. They have their weaknesses as well. And I think we must always be aware of that. Question 9, what were his political views? Well, Charles Dickens was, overall, we'd say, if we use the term left-wing and right-wing, he was more left-wing. He was quite liberal, and he believed in changing society for the better. He sympathised with the poor, and he believed that one of the big things that the rich and the powerful, the ruling class, should do is to actually look after the poor. He believed that it was their duty to improve society and to intervene in society, not just let the conditions actually get worse, but to improve the conditions. One of the things that Dickens supported was what was called the Ragged Schools. Now, these were charitable organisations which were run to give some of the poorest children in the slums. So if we go back to that slum that Dickens visited in 1849, the slum of the Borough near London Bridge, these areas, the children had no education whatsoever. They were incredibly filthy and ragged. And what happened was charitable people gave them an education and a new set of clothes. I mean, if you look at these children, they seem to be quite well dressed. Well, of course, the thing is, that's after they were given the clothes to replace their rags. So Charles Dickens believed that those who were privileged, like himself, he became incredibly wealthy because of all the books he published. They had a duty to look after the poor. He did not believe in this idea, oh, who cares about the poor? As Scrooge says, or let them die and decrease the surplus population. He hated that inhuman approach towards the poor. That's why, if we go back to my earlier question, he comes down on the side of the poor in his attack on the workhouse system and Oliver Twist. Right, so we can say that Dickens believed in reform, and he was perhaps more towards the left than towards the right. But the thing is, he did not believe in revolution. He did not believe that the poor should rise up and change society in a violent way. In one of his books, A Tale of Two Cities, he describes the French Revolution. The two cities are London and Paris, and they set the background for his story. And in the book, he describes the beginning of the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille. Now, the thing is, Charles Dickens would have had a lot of sympathy for the poor people of France, in the same way he had sympathy for the poor people of Britain. But he thought the revolution went too far. And when he describes later on the use of the guillotine to execute those who opposed the revolution, he believed that revolution was not the answer, because you actually created more problems than the problems that you wanted to solve. He believed that reform was better. You see, this is reform. This is improving the conditions of the poor in a nice, slow, and respectable way. You bring the poor up in terms of their level of culture and education. A revolution, on the other hand, gets out of control, and the poor people, they take vengeance on the rich, and they destroy property, and there's huge amounts of violence and death. And remember that Charles Dickens would have lived in a very nice house, and he would have lived a very attractive existence. So therefore, he does not want to have any kind of revolution which would destroy that. So in A Tale of Two Cities, his sympathies are with the poor, and in fact, he makes that absolutely, he can understand why there was a revolution, but he does not believe that revolution is the answer. The answer to making society better was slow change through reform. You get rid of the evils in society one by one, and you gradually make society better, rather than trying to overthrow society all at once. Okay? And that's also the idea of Scrooge as well, because he changes and he becomes somebody who cares about other people. He becomes a philanthropist, somebody who loves mankind. That's what the word philanthropist means, and wants to do good. And that's what Dickens believed in. He believed that rich people had a duty to do that. He believed the government had a duty to do that, and that was the way to improve society, not revolution. He did not believe the common people were able to run society on their own. They needed to be told what to do by their betters. If you look there, the school teachers are giving instruction to the poor children, and that's almost sums up Dickens's view. Those with wealth and education had a duty to raise the position of the poor, to treat them more humanely. That was the way forward for Dickens. My last question, question 10. Why is Dickens seen as a great writer? This is a picture of Dickens towards the end of his life. He's fallen asleep in his study, and all his characters are kind of appearing in kind of dreams around him. Well, the thing is, Dickens, first of all, was a great storyteller. He could craft a story. Sometimes the stories are a little bit improbable, a bit hard to believe in terms of coincidences and all that. But he loved a good story. And most of Dickens's stories have happy endings. So, for example, in Great Expectations, the character of Pip meets up with his love, Estella. Originally, Charles Dickens did not want to have that happy ending, but one of his friends actually suggested that people would rather have a happy ending, so he changed the ending so that Pip would become married to Estella and they would go off together, arm in arm, into the sunset, that kind of thing. He had great characters, particularly comic characters. People like Mr. Micawber in David Copperfield, Mr. Pickwick, Mrs. Gamp, who was a bit of a drunken nurse in the book, Martin Chuzzlewit, and so many others. He was able to look at the great, comic genius of the English. Really, the English have always had a kind of a comical side. They've always laughed at themselves, always have done. That's why British comedy, if you think of Dad's Army and things like that, that kind of comic tradition has always been there in Britain, in Britain, and it was something that Dickens recognised. He saw comic characters everywhere, but he could also have serious and nasty characters. Characters like Bill Sikes in Oliver Twist, or characters like Uriah Heep in David Copperfield, who were not very nice people by any standards of the imagination. So he could look at the darker side of life. Having said that, all of his novels were for a middle class audience, and he kept the really nastiest sides of things, particularly to do with sex, out of it. There's no swearing in Dickens, and there's no outright descriptions of sexual activity in Dickens, which you get with novelists in France who are much less, unwilling to offend. It's almost like Dickens was a family writer, but he does make, he does describe the conditions of the poor, but in actual fact, they're never really as bad as they really were. So, for example, if you go back to that thing there about the slums, one of the features of London slum life was the incredibly high level of prostitution. But Dickens doesn't really write too much about that. He kind of hints that certain people may be acting as prostitutes, but he doesn't talk about it openly. And that is something that was a feature of so many writers of the Victorian period. So, coming back to Dickens as a great writer, he's a great storyteller. He has great characters. And he wrote so many books. I mean, he was 58 when he died, but there's so many books. Great Expectations, David Copperfield, Bleak House, Martin Chuzzlewit, Christmas Carol. Most of his books are really long. Christmas Carol is by far the shortest of his books. But he was one of the great writers of English literature. So there we are, everybody. That is the story of Charles Dickens. Thanks for listening.